rich land between two wide rivers. They loved the green of their forest, the blue of their clear skies, and the bright sunlight of their open fields. They raised their children to love the land as they did. All of this, they said, the blue of the sky, the red of the sun, and the green of the forest, the Great Spirit has given to us, the people. And so they lived in peace with one another and with the verdant land. One thing, however, which the people never did was to venture across the great rivers. Beyond these blue barriers, they warned their children, are evil beings who do not respect life. Only the width of the great rivers protect us from the others. One day, a girl fell asleep while fishing in a small boat in one of the tributaries. The current gently carried her out into the great river. When the girl finally awoke, darkness had fallen, and she felt panic on the wide waters. She paddled furiously for shore, but when she landed, it looked strange to her. Cold, damp, and hungry, she wandered inland until she saw a distant campfire. She burst breathless into the clearing, expecting to find her people. But as she glanced around the campfire, she froze. The faces and the clothes of the figures there were strange and threatening. They were the others. For a long moment, no one moved. Then an old man pointed to the food cooking on the fire and to her. He was inviting her to eat with them. The girl stayed with the others for several days, sharing their hospitality and their lives. They were different from her in many ways, yet somehow alike. They spoke to her of their love for their green fields, blue skies, and red sunsets. They spoke, too, of their great fear of what lay across the wide waters. When she tried to explain that she had come from there, they were astonished. How could a beautiful person such as you have come from the terrible land of the other? Finally, the day came for the girl to return home. She got into her small boat and paddled out into the middle of the river. It didn't seem so wide any longer, and so she paused, suspended in thought. From where she floated, she could see both banks of the river equally well. She could see the identical green of the trees, the brightness of the sun, the overarching blue of the sky. For a moment, it seemed that the great river was not a barrier, but a great blue-green ribbon tying the two worlds into one. The girl drifted for a time in the great river, listening to the music of the water and dreaming of what could be. In the 4 years that I have been your pastor, I have preached on the subject of peace many times, and I recall with great fondness how the eyes of our good friend Vince Kavalowski would always light up whenever I did. Both Vince and Jane were friends of this church for many years, until last year when they joined the church, right before life carried them in a new direction. And while I'm happy that they are in a better place, I do miss them profoundly. I remember visiting with them in their farmhouse and the conversations we had, and I always felt like the luckiest person in the world to be able to sit and talk with these amazing advocates for peace, who not only understood it and worked for it, but who also lived it every single minute of their lives. Not long before they left, I visited with Vince, and he gifted me with one of his books called Dreaming the World Awake. And the story that I just read to you was taken from that book. It's titled, Who is the Enemy? And it reflects perfectly our lesson for today. We've been away from the narrative lectionary for a few weeks, so let us recall that after God delivered the Hebrew people out of Egypt, God created a covenant with them, brought them to the promised land, gave them prophets and kings, and established them as a nation. But as a tiny nation stuck between great world powers, they were constantly under the threat of attack, which often led them to wonder whether other gods might be a better fit than Yahweh. Assyria was the main superpower at the time, and as they made their way toward Judah, they wiped out everything in their path, including major cities and the northern kingdom of Israel. And that brings us to today's reading, with the Assyrians standing at the gates of Jerusalem, threatening them with the same fate. The Assyrian king is a master of terror, and he begins his campaign by sowing seeds of doubt about Hezekiah and about God. Don't listen to Hezekiah, he tweets. He can't save you, and neither will his God. He then reminds the Hebrews of all the other nations he has just laid waste to on his way to Jerusalem, like no other king before him. He has destroyed more foes than anyone. And finally, if their gods couldn't save all the others, then what makes them think that Yahweh will save them? Be afraid. Be very afraid. Fear-mongering has been around for a long, long time, and it works. Tyrants have known for thousands of years that the most effective way to control people is to make them afraid. They know that once fear sets up shop in the collective consciousness, we do the majority of the work for them by going after each other. And tyrants are absolute geniuses when it comes to getting into our heads and using the things that we care about the most to provoke our fears. Tyrants are loud, and they create chaos wherever they go because they know that it is the loudest voice that grabs our attention first. Consider the daily bombardment from Facebook, Twitter, and cable news. It's been so loud for so long that it almost seems normal, doesn't it? We have been duped into believing that this is just the way things are. This is the reality of our world now. But this is not reality. It is fear-mongering. And when we give in to our fears, we find ourselves in denial of the deep, true reality of God's life within and among us. Even when we know God is faithful, the megaphone of fear captures our attention, dominates our awareness, and banishes our trust in God to a distant whisper. Fear motivates people to do all sorts of things that they wouldn't do otherwise. It motivates us to lash out at nameless, faceless others, whether they be Muslims, Jews, immigrants, or simply people who live on the other side of the river. It gives people a distorted sense of unity based on keeping out the other. It leads us to spend money we don't have on things we don't need, and it convinces us that there's not enough to go around. So Hezekiah turns to Isaiah, who proclaims that it is not God's desire that the Assyrians prevail, but it is God's desire that the house of Jacob teach his ways and walk in his paths, a people of peace and life for all nations. And remarkably, Hezekiah paid heed. He warned the people ahead of time not to listen to the threats, to keep their gaze focused on the God who had delivered them, rather than the bullies standing at the gate, no matter how impressive their uniforms were. And he turns to Isaiah to help him keep his eyes on God. The most often used phrase in Scripture is "be not afraid." And while telling people not to be afraid doesn't automatically banish all fear, it is the first step to interrupting the false narrative of intimidation. Be not afraid is the word of truth in the midst of all the lies and deceits. And if we are to turn this narrative around, we must proclaim this word to one another again and again and again. Because when our gaze shifts from a horizon of fear to a horizon of hope, we find that our trust in God will begin to grow deep roots. And that is the best legacy that we can leave behind in a world that has forgotten how to love. Fear is the strongest motivation humans know, except for love. Internalized fear makes us believe that our security lies somewhere other than God. But when we draw our eyes back to the one who made us, the one who knows the exact number of hairs growing on our heads, the one who keeps us and saves us, we know that this is the one who has the final word. This is the one who defines reality. And this is the one who steeps us in the kind of love that casts out all fear. This is our path to peace. That's the way back to sanity. When we live in God's love, we reclaim our ability to see both banks of the river equally well. We see the identical green of the trees, the brightness of the sun, and the overarching blue of the sky. And we see that the great river is not a barrier after all, but a great blue-green ribbon tying all of our worlds into one. May it be with you all, according to God's word.